The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We find ourselves in the New Democratic Party with Bill 4 in an odd position, the position of defending a piece of government legislation which the government has not had the courage to defend themselves. We find ourselves participating in a path to passage of this bill, a path to passage in which our opponents have represented themselves in ways that have been variously vacillating, posturing, capitulating. And I would like to add a few comments this evening to this debate, including a few comments on the bizarre and irregular road by which this bill has made it to third reading. But I would like to begin by reasserting the position our party took on second reading of the Biodiversity Act when it was in previous form before us, namely, that the Act is an entirely welcome and an entirely necessary piece of legislation. Bill McGibbon, in his 2019 book, Falter, Has the Human Game Begun to Play Itself Out?, places special significance on the fact that there are now half as many wild animals on Earth as there were in 1970, as there were, Mr. Speaker, when I was in high school. McGibbon calls this, these are his words, and I will table them in a few moments, an awesome and mostly unnoticed silencing. And well, he might. Dr. Michelle Adams, Director, and Professor Karen Beasley from the School for Resource and Environmental Studies at Dalhousie point out in a statement issued in response to the government's announcement of its amendments to the Act prior to the meeting of the Committee on Law Amendments that our Provincial Endangered Species Act, these are their words, lists 71 species with 5 now globally extinct and 3 provincially extinct, and that biodiversity collapse and climate change are twin crises representing emergencies for humanity, unquote. This precisely, Mr. Speaker, is our view. And I will table both of these documents. Thank you. We were therefore surprised and disappointed when the government moved, prior to submissions to law amendments, to introduce drastic modifications to the bill. One struggles with how best to characterize these changes. It is less like the bill received amendment and more like it received amputation. Just visually, it is startling to look at the modified bill, the modified document itself. The Act which we supported on second reading contained 19 pages of text, of which the bill now has 7 pages expunged. I'm sorry, the bill now has 7 pages left and 12 pages expunged. In the physical text, the deleted parts of the Act are in red and are crossed out, so that on page after page, looking at the red crossed out parts, it is as though one acquires the impression as though the Act were itself bleeding, which indeed it is. Bleeding its scope in its confinement now to Crown lands, and bleeding its capacity with the removal of its sanctions, which, after all, are what distinguish a law from a mere government suggestion. The amputated, crossed out, red ink version of the Biodiversity Act, which is now before us, most singularly, is no longer a biodiversity law for all of Nova Scotia, but a biodiversity law for 3/10 of Nova Scotia, the part of the province that is Crown land. It is, in effect, now a kind of mini Biodiversity Act, if not a glorified biodiversity brochure. One reporter called this immediately a 180 And I suppose it is, although even that is somehow to impart a greater sense of backbone than here the government deserves. It is more like a shrinking, a shriveling of resolution, such that we can say there is at least one place where species loss is not taking place. There is a new species of invertebrates now in our province, the Nova Scotia Liberals. And why? As a consequence of a highly financed, high-intensity marketing and pressure campaign by Forest Nova Scotia through what has essentially been admitted to be a front organization calling itself the Concerned Private Landowner Coalition. Now, much ire, Mr. Speaker, has been directed against Forest Nova Scotia over its so-called Stop Bill 4 campaign. Personally, I think the campaign's vilification of what the ads referred to as Halifax activists with a capital A, mind you, personally, I think it's rather beneath the standard that the organization's members should expect, and at the cost of compromising the moral authority of Forest Nova Scotia's voice. I do not, however, place the culpability for the present gutting of the Biodiversity Act on Forest Nova Scotia. Forest Nova Scotia, after all, has as one of its significant purposes to be a lobby group, a pressure group. That's what lobby groups and pressure groups do. They lobby and they bring on pressure. Government, however, has a different job. The government's job is to bring forward policy proposals consistent with its sense of what is needed, to consult about them authentically and widely, and then, when the matter is brought forward, to make the case for its program and to make the case for its beliefs in the public democratic sphere. I think of a previous intense lobbying and pressure campaign of Forest Nova Scotia's a decade ago, when the organization was known as Forest Products. The campaign was directed towards the previous NDP government's response to the natural resource strategy in 2011 to institute a 50% limit on clear-cutting to be phased in over a period of 5 years. Government MLAs were deluged with emails, phone calls, visits, and meetings, all bearing the repeated echoes and messaging, as they say, of Forest Products' campaign against the measure. One conversation in particular from that time stands out. A contractor with Wagner's came to see me one day in the office I had at that time in Stewiacke and talked with me about all the reasons, as he saw it, that the government should stay out of the clear-cutting regulating business. We had a good exchange in which we, I thought, listened to one another. And I did my best to explain why it seemed to me that the clear-cutting limits were the best road forward for rural Nova Scotia. After an hour or so, he got up to go. I asked him just casually about his family. He had a couple little kids. And I asked him then whether or not he would be advising his kids when they got through school to follow him and go in the woods, as he had. No, he said. By that time, there won't be anything there for them. I explained that that was all I was really trying to say. And he explained that he was there actually on behalf of his employer, and he could kind of see what I was trying to get at. Now, none of that whole important process, Mr. Speaker, took place with this Biodiversity Act. What happened instead is that in the face of the first anticipatable critical headwinds, the government eviscerated their own legislation, leaving behind material which I acknowledge is useful and constructive, certainly, but which nevertheless has the character of a shell. And what carried this from the odd to the bizarre is that the Liberals did this before the dozens of submissions to the Law Amendments Committee, with the text of the bled-out version of the Act made available only just before that committee's meeting, so that many presenters there found themselves giving carefully prepared remarks that were addressed to a bill that was no longer on the table. It is as though the government were participating in a boxing match, and as soon as they heard their opponent come out of the dressing room, they punched themselves, laid down on the mat, and asked the referee to call it. What's the word for that? Ineffective? Capitulating? Vacillation? Probably all three. Mr. Speaker, I invite you to consider what would have happened at Boat Harbor with Northern Pulp if the government had taken this subservient approach. I think it might have been an altogether different story. Nor is it credible for the Premier to contend that the bulk of the bill has been removed because the government, to use his word, was, quotes, listening to the public. We have a pretty good system for listening to the public in legislative matters in Nova Scotia, and that is the Law Amendments Committee process. If listening were what the government was doing in the great biodiversity shrivel, surely they would have done that after and not before people said and submitted the things they wanted to have heard. As I say, Mr. Speaker, it has been a very odd debate. This is also true in the case of our Conservative opponents, who on the coattails of Forest Nova Scotia have come to the discussion loaded for bear and battle, only to find the government having said, "Uncle," before they got there. A few words about the Conservatives' discourse in this biodiversity discussion. A steady and recurring theme in what the Conservatives have had to say in discussion of this bill to this point, Mr. Speaker, is that government is something that imposes things on you. That government is something that cramps and constrains you by telling you what to do. That government, in fact, does all this imposing and telling from a position of not actually knowing what it's doing. This was evident in a Conservative line of leading questioning of witnesses at the Law Amendments Committee with the question, who do you think is best to direct your woodlot, the government or you? This was evident in debate at the Committee of the Whole, where the leader of the Conservative opposition quoted Ronald Reagan, although I don't remember whether or not he realized or said he was quoting Reagan, to the effect that the most dangerous words in the English language are, "We're from the government and we're here to help." You could certainly hear it in the proposed and defeated Conservative amendment, underlining, highlighting, and placing in capital letters the fact that the Act would be limited to Crown land. As though, Mr. Speaker, the making of public laws in areas beyond the government's own buildings, the government's own land, the government's own employees, were somehow of its nature an odious, an illegitimate incursion. Now, Mr. Speaker, this line of reasoning, to which we have been listening in recent weeks a great deal, draws from a well. And that is the well of neoconservatism associated with figures like Mr. Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, or in Canada, Stephen Harper and his successors. And there are a number of components of this well, ranging from fiscal to deregulatory approaches, but the core defining features of this well are its twin tenets of veneration of the private sector on the one hand and denigration of government, denigration of the public sector on the other. I want to make two observations about this overall outlook which are relevant to the present debate. Number one, this overall outlook is so pre-IPCC. From the time of the United Nations issuing of the International Panel on Climate Change's special report in October 2018, which galvanized the world with its incontrovertible presentation of what is required to keep global heating below 1.5 degrees within the next now 9 years, and the attendant mobilization of the world around the necessity to coordinate, focus, and invest every available capacity to the accomplishing of this goal. Through all that time, the importance of government is the only agent with the capacity to bring about this change is something that has asserted itself in the public understanding. I think of Seth Klein's 2020 book, A Good War, in which he analyzes how only government was able to marshal the resources to defeat fascism in World War II, and how government now must adopt a parallel role with parallel scope in order to avert the existential crisis, and how this thinking about the matter in Klein's volume speaks to the recasting currently of the public mind. The recent Supreme Court of Canada decision regarding the Federal Greenhouse Gas Pollution Pricing Act also highlights this, namely that climate change is, of course, real, but also that it requires coordinated and collective action. That's point one. Point two. The neoconservative government denigrating view is just so entirely pre-COVID. COVID has deeply reawakened our overall society's understanding of the capacity of government for good. When COVID hit, and our backs in all kinds of unpredictable ways were suddenly put up against the wall, the world did not turn to Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, or Warren Buffett, but rather to governments across the board. It was governments who expedited the development of vaccines and are implementing the logistics of their rollouts. It was government when incomes overnight went in the tank, which brought forward programs like CERB and CRB with a speed and efficiency that neoconservatives had always belittled their capacity to muster. It is government, to a profound extent, that is upholding small and medium and large business at the moment with the wage subsidy. And we can expect that business conversations about the wisdom of government spending may not be the same when we hear them in the future. That's the second point. Mr. Speaker, I submit that the Conservatives' discourse on the Biodiversity Act draws utterly from a well and inhabits utterly a world that has become irrelevant in the era of climate change and COVID, and which throughout their discussion on Bill 4 has shown their approach to be both outdated and anachronistic. Mr. Speaker, all the protestations from the Leader of the Conservative opposition that he believes in the reality of climate change do not change this, because they do not change the fact that his is the party in Nova Scotia of fracking, of uranium mining, a party 1/5 of whose members in Nova Scotia voted for Maxime Bernier to be their leader, a party who in parallel numbers voted in Nova Scotia, mind you, Mr. Speaker, voted in 2020 to be led by the extreme figures Derek Sloan and Leslyn Lewis, and a party that if there were a single one of their present MLAs who didn't stump and proclaim their support for Stephen Harper or Andrew Scheer in recent federal elections, that MLA indeed would qualify as an endangered species. And I want to return, Mr. Speaker, to the debate on Bill 4 itself, as we have experienced it to this point. In debate in Committee of the Whole, the member for Halifax-Needham offered a straightforward reflection on the genesis of the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act based on a podcast she had heard to the effect that the source of that bill was a particular moment of opportunity in which Mark Parent, the Minister of Environment at the time, and William Leahy, Deputy Minister, found themselves, she said, the adults in the room. The Leader of the Conservative opposition took exceptional umbrage at this reflection and accused her of characterizing other members of that cabinet as, his word, children. Mr. Speaker, in his response to the member for Halifax-Needham, the Leader of the Conservative opposition has expressed himself with an inadequate sense of measure. Adults in the room is a metaphor. It is an expression familiar in the titles of films and books and essays. Nowhere does it ever indicate that the speaker thinks of others than those named as, to quote him, children. Is the leader of the Conservative opposition suggesting, for example, of economist Yanis Varoufakis' book, Adults in the Room, about the EU and the financial crisis a decade ago in Europe? Is he suggesting that Varoufakis is saying that Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron are children? Surely not, Mr. Speaker, because the expression doesn't mean that. So much does it not mean that, in fact, that one is left to wonder what has underlied the opposition leader's out-of-scale response. And I suspect that it may have to do, Mr. Speaker, with a certain frustration that his Liberal opponents laid down in the ring before he got there, A, and B, that his party has really become irrelevant on the great biodiversity question of this era. Yes, Mr. Speaker, a strange debate. And this bill has followed a course that is bizarre and odd. And that is entirely unfortunate, in my view, because something is being lost from view in all this Liberal subservience and Conservative irrelevance, namely the emergency of biodiversity loss itself. No member of any party, surely, is going to challenge the portrayal in the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risks Report that the human species is already responsible for the loss of 83% of all wild animals and half of plants. That over 10,000 species are going extinct each year. That the current accelerating rate of species extinction is tens to hundreds of times greater than over the past 10 million years. This calls precisely for action of the sort and at the level of what was presented in the Biodiversity Act as it was put forward here at first and second reading, and which we indicated our support for at that time. We in the NDP also, in fact, find ourselves in this moment on this bill between the posturing of the Conservatives and the capitulation of the Liberals. We find ourselves also to be in fact, the adults in the room. And although we are critical of the fact that the government is carrying forward less of a Biodiversity Act than was first presented, we also understand that there remain features in this legislation which will be positive in their impact. And we understand particularly the urgency of our provinces having, as the legislation puts it in its longer title, an act to provide for the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity in Nova Scotia. The New Democratic Party will be voting for this bill. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.